Well, welcome to the 26th episode of Ideas and Lives, where we interview people with interesting lives and compelling ideas. And today we're pleased to have someone who has certainly both and is an old friend and colleague of Zvi Bodie's, my co-host. And so I'm going to let Zvi introduce our guest today, Ben Friedman.
Okay, well, it is indeed a pleasure. In fact, I can't believe it took 26 interviews before we got to Ben. That he should have been our first interview. Anyhow, be that as it may, Ben and I go back to the 1970s. Oh my God, I can't believe.
I published a paper together in, I think, 1975 or something.
Unbelievable. It was my first publication, yes. And you were still an assistant professor, I think, at Harvard.
Probably so. Probably
right.
So.
And you had procured for me a consulting job with Morgan Stanley on what they called cushion bonds, if you remember that.
Yes, absolutely.
And it was very much related to the paper that we published. So, Ben, I want to thank you again for getting me started on both my academic career, publishing, and my consulting career.
Well, if I was helpful, so much the good.
Yes, you certainly were. All right, I am going to ask you some questions just so that we stay organized. Wait a second. Here we go. And I wrote them, I have them here. So you were born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. Does that have any influence on the way you live and think today?
I don't think so, Zvi. I suppose if the question is, does it matter that I didn't grow up in New York? Maybe so. But as opposed to whether Louisville, Kentucky matters versus Chicago versus St. Louis versus Philadelphia, any non-New York place, I don't think it mattered. I had lots of friends growing up from all of those places. I have lots of friends from there now. And Louisville, Kentucky was a very pleasant place to grow up. I enjoyed that very much. I had lots of friends there. I had lots of family there. And it was, I have nothing but fond memories of the place. But as to any particular influence, I don't think so, or at least I'm not aware of it.
Well, maybe, I'm from South Bend, Indiana.
Oh, well, that's very close.
And it's in the northern part of the state, but Indiana is very close.
Yeah.
And I think it is, we recognize that sometimes New Yorkers or Bostonians think that they are the end of the world. And I think we have a more open feeling about it. But tell us a little more about growing up and high school and
how did your family make a living?
My father was a businessman, and my family had been in that part of the world for quite a long time. My first ancestor who arrived in the United States came shortly before the Civil War and arrived in Cincinnati, which is up the river. And my family lived in Cincinnati for some decades. My father was born in Cincinnati in the very early years of the 20th century. And then for business reasons, when my father was a very small child, his father moved across the river. So my family then lived in various parts of Kentucky, where they ran different businesses. And then again, as a matter of business opportunity, they moved into Louisville in the 1920s. So
was it retail? What kind of business was it?
My father did a variety of things. Part of it was retail, but I think the heart of the business was industrial uniform contracting, and that's not quite retail. And
No.
so what he would do was to get contracts to provide uniforms for businesses that had their employees wear uniforms. And the core of that, although he did lots of different things, manufacturing plants, forest rangers, taxi drivers, all of that sort of thing, the core of the business and where I think the real money was in gasoline service stations, in which, if you remember those days,
Yeah.
if you pulled into a gas station, people were wearing Gulf uniforms or Shell uniforms or whatever.
Mexico, the Milton Berle show.
In those days, yes, yes, yes. And what my father would do would get contracts so that he would provide the uniforms for all of the employees of all of an oil company's service stations by state. And so I think, he had maybe 13 states of Gulf oil. He had maybe 20 states of Standard Oil, as it was called before the days in which it was Exxon. And this was a pretty big business, because in those days, the way it worked is that every employee at a service station had to wear uniforms. And each employee got, as I recall, 4 uniforms per year, 2 in the winter and 2 in the summer. So if you multiply the number of gas stations in a state by, pick a number, 10 employees times 4 uniforms per employee times however many states he was doing for that, this got to be a pretty good business. And he did other things as well, but that was.
Did you participate in it at all? Did you help?
In an indirect way. When I was in junior high school and high school, I used to spend Saturdays at the business. Yes, so I was.
Well, that might have been an influence.
I was familiar with what was going. Yes, I think that's right. I think growing up in the family of somebody who ran a small to medium-sized business was definitely an intellectual influence, but the fact that the business was located in Kentucky as opposed to Indiana, as opposed to Ohio,
could have been anywhere.
Colorado, I've never figured out any particular influence there.
Well, I should mention that Bob is also from a family business background, steel warehouse.
Steel service.
You're right. Okay, well, let me see. So what would you say were the most important influences on you in your youth, pre-Harvard?
Well, I would say too, education. We've already talked about the fact that I came from a business family, and I think what matters is we're not talking about my father worked for General Motors or something like that. We're talking about somebody who ran a small to medium-sized business. And so I was constantly, and all of my uncles did something roughly similar. Some of them worked for my father, some of them were on their own. But when I was growing up around the family, I was just constantly exposed to the conversation of people who ran their own businesses. And I think that was influential. The other thing that I would point to is that in those days, the public schools in a place like where I grew up were very, very good. It's hard to say, it's sort of awkward to say it, but one of the casualties, I think, of the loosening of the labor market and the making of opportunities available to women, which of course is a good thing, is that this captive labor force that educated people like me isn't there anymore. So I went to public schools, And the teachers were by and large these unbelievably smart women. And these were all women who today would be doctors, they would be lawyers, they would be partners of investment firms, Lord knows what. But in those days, it's, sorry to say, in those days, those kinds of opportunities were not available for women. And of course, many women chose not to work at all. But those who did, these were typically unmarried women. And so they had to work, and they typically worked as school teachers, and they were unbelievably bright, and they were just super good teachers. I remember some of them in particular. When I was in high school, I had an English teacher who I would give all the credit for teaching me how to write. If you think about what we do as academics, we write. And
So true. Especially you write books.
well, especially in the last few decades, I've turned from a lot of my attention from writing technical papers to be read by economists to writing things that with luck are read by the broad American and even foreign reading public. And if I were to point to one person who's responsible for my ability to do that, it would be this high school English teacher I had. And second, I would point to the equally smart woman who taught me Latin. For some reason, I've never understood. It's true today, incidentally. I noticed it when my boys were in school. People learn the structure of language not in English class, but in Latin class. And it happened to me. It happened to my sons also going through school. And where I really learned the structure of the language was taking Latin. And so this interplay between the Latin teacher and the English teacher left me with an ability to write, and it stood me in very good stead. Now, I had other good teachers as well, but the ones that stand out in my mind were the English teacher and the Latin.
Did they follow your career, your subsequent career? Do you know? Were you in touch with them?
No, I was not very good about that. So
yeah, neither was I.
I have no idea. But I'll tell you one incident. Some years ago, my high school had a fundraising campaign in which they put in a brick walkway. And what you were supposed to do was buy a brick for some unbelievable amount of money, which clearly had nothing to do with the cost of the brick. And I think what it was assumed that people were going to do was have their own name inscribed on the brick. But instead of having my name on the brick, I told them to put the English teacher's name on the brick.
Oh, what a great idea.
Well, here we are all of these years later. But I'm coming up on my 60th high school reunion.
Oh my God.
This summer. I don't think I'm going to get there, but I'm coming up. But all these years later, I remain very grateful. I remember very clearly the education in writing that I had from this woman, and I remain very grateful for it because it stood.
Did that motivate you to apply to Harvard or to go to a top school?
No, if anything, that was I went to a high school where the presumption was that good students were supposed to go to Yale. And so if you were a good student at some stage in my high school, at some stage, the guidance counselor would come along and hand you a Yale handbook. But for some odd reason in my family, it was assumed that I was supposed to go to Harvard. So I did. And that's not because I had ancestors who had gone to Harvard, but I think it was mostly my mother. My mother was from New York, so my mother was very plugged into things like that, and she and her family just assumed I was supposed to go to Harvard, and I did.
So
So what
tell
is-
us, tell us about your Harvard experience.
Well, I would say the two most formative people in my undergraduate experience were Otto Eckstein and Jim Dusenberry, with both of whom I remained very close. And in fact, I'm still in touch with Otto's widow. Neither Otto nor Jim are with us anymore. Nor is Jim's wife, but Otto's widow is very much still around, and I talk to Harriet from time to time. I took a course from Otto in the fall of my freshman year. I took introductory economics as a freshman. I never had any economics. I'm not sure any high schools in those days taught economics, but mine certainly did not. So I took introductory economics as a freshman. And then in the fall of my sophomore year, I took a macroeconomics core policy course from Otto. And then in the spring, I believe, of my sophomore year, I took a more monetary financial oriented macro course from Jim Dusenberry. And then I was in touch with both of those people. And then when I got to my senior year, at Harvard, honors students then and now write honors theses. And so in the spring, in my senior year, I signed up to do my honors thesis with Jim Dusenberry. But at that time, Otto was on the Council of Economic Advisors. And in the middle of my senior year, Jim's leave ran out and he had to come back to Harvard. And was the other
Jim
way
was
around.
on the council.
I was doing my thesis with Jim Dusenberry, and Otto was at the Council of Economic Advisors. And in the spring of at mid-year of my senior year, Otto's leave ran out. So he came back to Harvard and Jim took his place at the Council of Economic Advisors. So in the middle of my senior year, I lost Jim as my advisor, but then Otto took over. So I had both of them, not only as classroom instructors, but also as senior thesis advisors. It was Jim at the first half of the year and Otto in the second. So those were overwhelmingly the two instructors who were most influential for me as an.
Did you ever have anything to do with Eckstein's venture, the
data resources?
data resource?
The answer is no. And to be very honest with you, I always felt I dodged a bullet because I was very close to Otto. I was away for my 2 years in Cambridge when Otto started up that business. And many people like me, both Harvard junior faculty and also Harvard graduate students interested in macroeconomics, got absorbed into working for DRI, as it was called, Data Resources Incorporated. And looking back on it, I think it's clear, and who knows what these people would say, but looking back on it, I think it was a career distraction for many of them. I think many of them could have gone on to very promising academic careers, and they didn't. I think the reason they didn't is that they got absorbed into this. And at one level, it was very exciting in those days. They were building a macroeconometric model. And in macroeconomics, the macroeconometric models of large scale were a big deal. And so there was nothing wrong with it. But in the long run, as I say, I think I dodged a bullet by the fact that I was away when Otto started the business, and by the time I got back, Otto had pretty well staffed up the business, and moreover, I came back from the other Cambridge with my own intellectual program. And I remember again, Otto and I were good friends, and Otto did have me out to lunch at DRI. It was just out in Lexington, Mass. And he had me out there for lunch one day and showed me around. But it's conceivable that the reason he had me out was that he was looking to see if there was a place for me. And maybe after he talked to me about what he was doing, he just shrugged his shoulders and didn't bother to try. But nobody ever offered me a job at DRI. And in retrospect, I'm glad.
Yeah,
I want to add a footnote, Sweet. I just want to add a footnote to your earlier comment, because I was a summer intern at the Council of Economic Advisors when Duesenberry was there.
Okay.
And I remember preparing something. I was asked to prepare something. I'm not really remembering exactly what it was, and I was thinking about doing regressions and doing complicated things. And we had a meeting with Duesenberry. I think Stan Friedlander and I had a meeting with Duesenberry. And he sort of said, well, let's simplify this. Let's see what the tables actually show. And I remember that very well, that, he, in a way, gave me an example that, let's start with the basics of what we're really looking at here. I don't know whether that was true in your case, but.
Oh, yeah, no, Jim was a very intuitive thinker. And in many ways, I think it held him back in his academic career because of his PhD dissertation on the saving issue, which made him famous. His academic career was of some modest success, but I think he just never could force himself to do the kind of close analytical work that economics values. And I think part of it is that he was such a strong, intuitive thinker that he always felt once he'd worked his way intuitively through a problem, the close analytics was just so much window dressing for him, and he just couldn't. He didn't have the patience for it.
With one exception, perhaps, I have a vague recollection that he was an early adopter of linear programming in economics. He co-authored a textbook on linear programming applications in economics, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 70s, I think. But I could be wrong.
We'll look it up.
Right, exactly.
Afterward, let's just say I am unaware of that book.
Right. Well, I was a big fan of his theory of the consumption function.
Well, that was classic work, and of course,
right.
It was really a form of the model. He and Franco Modigliani had the same idea at the same time. And they both agreed that it was different forms of the same idea. And I can't remember if it was Jim or Franco who told me that they were both presenting their papers at the same session of an AEA meeting one year. And I can't remember whether it was Jim or Franco who told me that Jim went first. And as Jim was presenting his paper, the whole time, Franco just kept bobbing his head up and down. yes. But what it may have been Franco who told me that story. I can't remember.
Right.
You went on to Cambridge, England, I guess.
Yes, I did. I spent 2 years.
Tell us about that experience.
Well, it was very formative for me, Bob. I went not because I wanted to study economics at Cambridge. They had a distinguished economics department and the legacy of Keynes and all that, although to be blunt, that was pretty well gone by the time I got there. I went simply because I wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge for a couple of years in those days, and still at least among our students at Harvard, that's still very much a thing to do. And I applied for the usual range of scholarships, and the one I won was a Marshall Scholarship. And so I went to Cambridge as a Marshall Scholar. And again, this is still this was a popular thing to do in those days, and it still is. I have a
Yeah.
student, I have a student in this year's graduating class at Harvard who's a Rhodes Scholar for next year, and I have a student who graduated last year who's all in her first year as a Rhodes Scholar this year. So, and I think in my class at Harvard there were 10 Rhodes Scholars and
Wow.
five Marshall Scholars. So this was a major thing to do. So I went to Cambridge. And I did not go because I particularly wanted to study economics. To the contrary, as of the time I graduated from college, I assumed I was going to go to law school. And I did not apply to any American graduate schools. The only American places I applied to the Harvard and the Yale law schools, and that was it. That's all I applied to. But I also applied for these fellowships, and I won a Marshall Scholarship and went to Cambridge. And of course, once there, I had to study something. I wasn't really there for the academics, but I was there for the experience of living abroad. I'd never lived in a foreign country before. So that's why I was there. But as long as I was there, I had to study something. So I continued to study economics. And I was fortunate, interestingly, that the two people I studied with in Cambridge were the two people from Cambridge who went on to win Nobel Prizes, Dick Stone and James Mead. Stone was my principal supervisor. But it was in the process of those 2 years at Cambridge that I decided I would stick with economics. So when I returned to Harvard, after the 2 years, I returned because I was elected to the Society of Fellows at Harvard. I decided to stay with economics. So that did I learn a lot of useful economics at Cambridge? I'm not sure I did, but it was at Cambridge that I made the decision to switch from a trajectory that would have taken me to law school to an economics trajectory. So in that sense, Cambridge was very formative.
So you became a fellow before you did the graduate program?
Well, I was a graduate when I returned to Harvard. I'd been at Cambridge for 2 years, and then I was elected to the Society of Fellows. So I returned, and like most of the junior fellows, especially in those days, a lot of them have PhDs already now. It's these days being a junior fellow is often a postdoc, but in those days it wasn't. Most of us were graduate students. So I was a graduate student at Harvard while I wasn't going to classes particularly. I was just doing my own work. And so I was 3 years as a junior fellow at Harvard. And then when I finished, I had my choice between a Cambridge PhD and a Harvard PhD, and I chose the Harvard one. As I recall, I couldn't do both. I had to choose between them.
And what was your dissertation about?
My dissertation was about counter-cyclical, meaning against the business cycle, use of monetary and fiscal policy. No, in effect, it was the same.
It's a continuing issue.
Yeah, no. I've even back to introductory economics, I've always been more interested in macroeconomics than microeconomics. And within that, I've always been very interested in the policy aspects of macroeconomics. So monetary and fiscal policy was right in the mainstream of what I wanted to work on. And indeed, that's after I joined the Harvard faculty for about the first 20 years, that's what I worked on. So it was all very consistent.
Who was your thesis advisor, or plural advisors?
At Harvard, it was Marty Feldstein and Dale Jorgensen. But while I learned things from them about doing economic research, neither of them was really involved in the central thrust of the work, because it was a project what became my PhD dissertation was a project that I had started while I was at the other Cambridge. So in effect, they were overseeing my work on this large project that was well underway by the time I ever met either one of them.
So what year did you finish that dissertation?
1971, and I could have finished early, but there was no incentive to, and I was my junior fellowship started in the summer of '68, and it's typically a three-year thing, and so from '68 until '71, I was a junior fellow, and right at the end, when the junior fellowship was about to expire, then or run out, I submitted my dissertation and took my degree. So I have a 71.
Now my recollection is that through a lot of the 60s, there was a lot of discussion about trade-off between unemployment and inflation and Phillips curves, and Samuelson and Solow had a paper, and then Friedman, another Friedman, critiqued that with his work. How did your, if at all, your dissertation play into that?
I would say indirectly. I was well aware of that debate going on at the time, but that's not what I was working on. I've never done much work that bears on the labor market. That I think of that work as largely the labor side of macroeconomics, and I've always been much more interested in the financial market side, the money market, the bond market, and the way in which monetary and fiscal policies interact with the money and bond markets. And so you ask, how did it interact with that work? I would say the economic models that I was using embedded in them a view of the trade-off, to call it that.
Yeah.
So I was using, you wouldn't even call them new Keynesian. These were old Keynesian models. So for some purposes, I was using the Federal Reserve Board's model, the so-called FRB MIT model in those days, now called the MPS model, or now called the Furbus model. But this had been developed by Modigliani. And I was using the Wharton model, which had been developed by Laurie Klein and Albert Ando. And each of these models had in it, as their successors today still do have in them, models of the trade-off. So you could look at today's Furbus model, and now you have to extract large numbers of equations. But if you look at the labor and wage setting block of the Furbus model, and then you look at the price setting block at the Furbus model, you could condense that down into a view of exactly the trade-off that you are describing. And you could say, to what extent is the trade-off embodied in today's Furbus model consistent with what you're identifying as the Samuelson-Solow view? To what extent would it be consistent with the Milton Friedman view? Would be much closer to the Samuelson-Solow. In the short and medium run, it would be much closer to this Samuelson-Solow view. But the way in which my work had a tangency with that area of controversy was simply that it was embedded into whatever model I was using.
Now, when I met you in the early 70s, I think you had spent at least a year at Morgan Stanley.
Morgan Stanley, right. Yes, I did.
So how did that come about?
Well, for various lucky happenstances, mostly arranged for me by Jim Dusenberry, during my period as a graduate student and junior fellow at Harvard, I had a whole series of assignments working with various pieces of the Federal Reserve System. I had spent one summer working at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I had spent 2 summers working at the Board of Governors. I had an ongoing assignment as the consultant to the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. I participated, and looking back, it's really hard to believe I got to do this. I participated as a staff member of some quite high-level Federal Open Market Committee subcommittee. And so by the time I graduated with my PhD, I knew a fair amount about monetary policy and how that looked from the central bank side. But I realized that monetary policy affected the economy in those days largely through the bond market. And so I thought that it was important for me to find out how the bond market worked. And in those days, the premier bond firm for corporate bonds was Morgan Stanley. And through the good offices, now not of Duesenberry, but through the good offices of some people at the Federal Reserve Board, I got a job working at Morgan Stanley as the first economist they'd ever hired at Morgan Stanley. And it was fun. I got to do all sorts of things. The only thing I never did was actually sell securities in the United States because I never qualified for, what is it, the Series 7 exam or whatever it is. But I did all sorts. They had me do all sorts of things. I sold Eurobonds in Europe. I used to make the rounds and go visit all these investment houses in Zurich and Geneva and places like that. But I was very closely involved in, today you mentioned Morgan Stanley and everybody thinks of this firm with 100,000 people. When I worked at Morgan Stanley, there were 32 partners and 100 of the rest of us, and that was the entire firm. So wow. I got to see pretty much everything. And the culture of the firm was that everybody knew everybody. On the very first day, the practice was on the very first day when you arrived to work at Morgan Stanley, somebody would take you around to the firm and introduce you personally to everybody in the firm. And wow. The theory was that there shouldn't be any awkwardness, that if you walked into the men's room and you saw some person, you wouldn't know who that was. You were supposed to know everybody. And the firm was so small that I got to do everything. And so it was a tremendous learning experience. And I did that full-time for 1.5 years. And then when I went back to Harvard to start teaching, and then Svi, you mentioned this before, for some years thereafter, I retained a consulting arrangement with Morgan Stanley, which lasted up until they then established their own economics department, which as the firm grew, they finally did. But I provided economic consulting to them, and I continued to learn a lot. I liked the people enormously. And so that was the context in which I had been there, but the original purpose was that I would learn how the bond market worked.
I remember.
And did that affect your academic thinking?
Well, yes, it did. Yes, it did. Because if you look back at my work from those days, there is a whole series of papers on interest rate determination, represented by the supply of and the demand for corporate bonds. In those days, unlike today, in those days, the corporate bond market was the crux of long-term interest rate setting, for the simple reason that there were no current coupon government bonds in those days. Svi will remember this. There used to be a law which prevented the US Treasury from issuing long-term debt with a coupon of more than 4.25%. And when the law was passed, that may have been sensible, but then as we went through the 60s and the 70s, and inflation picked up and long-term interest rates rose, that meant that the US Treasury could not issue long-term debt as a practical matter. And so if there are no Treasury bonds, so the whole conversation today is about, if you talk to some corporation about issuing a bond, the whole conversation is, they could issue bonds at 74 basis points over Treasuries. That conversation did not happen then because there were no long-term current coupon Treasuries. And so it was the primary market determining the long-term interest rate was the corporate bond market. And I did, I looked at the market, and I was an economist. I think supply and demand. And to me, the interest rate was just the price of the bonds upside down. And so I had this whole rack of papers from the 70s and on a little bit into the 80s about the determination of long-term interest rates represented by the equilibrium of supply and demand in the corporate bond market.
And the way I got involved was because every corporate bond had a call option attached to it. And that's when I became familiar with call options. And it was around the time that the option pricing model was published by Black-Scholes. We didn't use the option pricing model, but we used the logic of option pricing. Today, I would say we were using risk neutral valuation.
Yeah, that's right. But what you and I were doing in that paper was some corporate bonds had 5-year call protection. Those were typically the utility bonds, and some bonds had 10 years of call protection. Those were typically the industrial bonds. And what you and I were doing, and this is all stuff I knew about from Morgan Stanley, because the firm's main business in which I was involved was issuing those bonds. So I was well aware of this difference between the 5s and the 10s. And what you and I were doing was using the difference between 5 years of call protection and 10 years of call protection as a way to get traction for backing out the market's expectation of future interest rates, because under some trajectories of future interest rates, the difference between 5 years and 10 years of call protection wouldn't matter, because you wouldn't be calling the bond in years 6 through 10 anyway. But under different expectations for long-term
and volatility, the volatility of interest rates. We were one of the first published papers on implied volatility.
That's right. And that was your contribution, because being close to Merton in the Bodie Friedman team,
yes,
you were the person who comparative advantage was knowing all about the option pricing model. So it was really your contribution to that line of research in which we looked at not just the first moments, but the second moments. But the whole idea had to do with using this trick of 5 years versus 10 years of call protection as a way of backing out the market's expectation for future interest rates.
Right. And we got it in a pretty good journal as well.
Well, the main paper we published was in the JPE, and that that's a fine journal today, and it was a fine journal then. So I was very pleased with the outcome of our work. But moreover, I learned a lot from you, because, to repeat, in the team, you were the one who.
Yeah, well, that was when I took the finance route.
Right.
And you were the monetary economic, and we worked together at the NBER. I was part of your project team at the National Bureau of Economic Research.
But reflecting on this again makes me realize how time dependent all of these things are. I'm guessing if I had been 5 or certainly 10 years younger and had been coming along later in my graduate study and had been exposed to the Merton Black-Scholes line of work earlier, I might also have gone into what you're
Yeah,
calling.
that was the exciting new stuff. No question about it.
Well, let's not go there because I always considered macroeconomics.
Yes.
exciting.
Yeah. Well,
But I think as a practical matter, if I had been coming along 5 or 10 years later and had been exposed to the Merton Black-Scholes line of work earlier on as a graduate student, when I was just forming my ideas for what I wanted to work on, it's entirely plausible that I would have wound up doing something in the finance, what you're calling the finance route instead of macroeconomics. But these things are all very, again, very time dependent. Bob, you were mentioning the Samuelson Solo versus Milton Friedman. If I had, I'm guessing if I had been a graduate student at MIT instead of Harvard, or certainly Chicago instead of Harvard, then I would have been in wanted to work probably on that aspect of the business cycle side of macroeconomics. But I think all of these things are very time and place dependent.
they are, but now let's talk about your more general books on ethics and religion and economics, because that clearly was not influenced by MIT. Well, maybe by Harvard. I don't know.
Well,
How did you evolve into it, basically?
Well, I would say there was both a pull and a push. And I would describe the pull this way. By the time I started to work on this broader intersection of economics and moral philosophy, which is the way I think about it, I had been teaching macroeconomics and doing macroeconomic research for at least 25 years. And as I recall, I was gearing up to teach the usual macro course at Harvard, which I taught sometimes to the undergraduates, but always to the graduate students. And here I was, and I'd been working all these years on and teaching policy-oriented macroeconomics. Well, what does that mean? For the business cycles part of macroeconomics, it means running monetary and fiscal policy in such a way as to keep the economy as close as possible to the frontier of possible production. And for the growth part of macroeconomics, it means getting the productivity growth rate as high as we can. And I remember one year I wanted to give an introductory lecture or two on why all this was important, because it had registered on me that for an economy as rich as ours, you could say, what difference does it make if we have a recession, And, recessions typically last 6 to 9 months. And a normal recession, the peak to trough decline of GDP is 3%. And moreover, it's very temporary. So why is this such a big deal? Why do we focus on this? And similarly, for the growth part of macroeconomics, we get all in an exercise about whether our productivity growth is going to be 1, or if we could get it up to 1.5, that's great. 2 would be outstanding. And, here we are, we live at a level that's so much greater than the way our grandparents and ancestors lived, and we live so much better than everybody else on the planet. Why do we care about all of that? And I thought it would be useful to give a motivational lecture or two right at the beginning of the course. And I started looking for readings, and I just assumed that there would be good papers on that. I said, okay, I'll go see, and I'll find which of Art Oken's papers, or which of Jim Tobin's papers, or maybe which of Bob Solo's papers I could assign. There was nothing. I didn't find anything. And so the more I stewed about this, the more it registered on me that there just was no good story about why. And again, this reflects the U.S. centric character of my work, which has been there all the way. You know, if you're living in 2/3 of the world's countries, the answer to why do you care about the growth rate is pretty obvious. You know, you want people to live longer. You want fewer people to starve, but that's not what it's about for us. So I started this line of thought in which I said, well, if if all these people like Okun and Tobin and Samuelson haven't had much to say on this, maybe I could. And that's what led to the first book project, the one that came out under the title, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. Now, I have to tell you that I had mentioned there was a pull and a push, and that was the pull. But I have to be honest and say there was a push, and that is that as we all know, technical economics is a game with a certain character to it. And increasingly, as people mature, it's not only that they're, well, I would put it, let me not implicate other people. I would say that my flair for doing that kind of work, I thought, was ebbing. And moreover, as happens in all scientific enterprises, the level of mathematical sophistication was getting greater and greater and greater. And I remember thinking that it just seems very odd that here I was, I was approaching, 50 years old or something like that. And it seemed very odd to be in a line of work in which the good news for all that I had done and learned, the good news would be that I could write a paper that's as good as some new graduate student. That just seemed odd to me, and so I said, "There's got to be some."
Well, let me ask you. I recall you were writing articles for the New York Review of Books, also.
Well, that's right. I mean, this didn't come out of the blue. I had been writing for the New York Review of Books, and that's been by far my greatest outlet over the years. There was a period of about 30 years where I wrote at least one article for them a year. So that was a major outlet. And also, I've always been interested in the broader, I've always read very widely. I value the fact that I'm at a university. I am not at I do not work at a technical institute. This matters. And I've always been very close to the historians, the philosophers, the literary people at Harvard. I'm going back to days in the Society of Fellows. It will not surprise you that Harvard has a bunch of discussion clubs of faculty that span many, many disciplines, and I participate joyously in quite a few of those. I've often co-taught courses. There was quite a long number of years where I co-taught a course with one of our political philosophy people. I still co-teach a course, not every year, but in some years, with a colleague who's in the English department, whose field is 18th century literature. We're doing the course again next fall. So you are right, Svi, that this did not come out of whole cloth.
No, I recall you were basically their economist that would explain economic issues to the readership of the New York Review of Books.
Yeah, that's right. I would say that. Well, along with other people like Bob Solo, especially Paul Krugman, and
good company.
Joe Stiglitz often would write for the review. But you're right. It was company I was very pleased to keep and proud of now. But so that was the book on the moral consequences of economic growth. I have a slightly harder time explaining the origins of the most recent book. For anybody who's listening who doesn't know, there's a great difference between the two books, because although both of them are very historical in their content, the book on the moral consequences of economic growth is largely political and social history interwoven with the economics. The book on religion and the rise of capitalism is largely intellectual history. And there, I think the story is in the first place to address your point, Svi. These things don't come right out of whole cloth. I've always been very interested in questions of ideas and where ideas come from. If you go back to the moral consequences of growth book, there are two chapters which come right at the front of the book, which incidentally I credit to my editor, because at Knopf, I originally had those chapters in the back, and to his credit, he told me to put them in the front, so I did. But there are two chapters on the intellectual history of the ideas that I was discussing in that book about what I called the moral consequences of economic growth. And if you go back to those chapters, you'll see that I kept tripping over the role of religion. And it just keeps coming up again and again. And I was never able to deal with it adequately. And so after that book was put to bed, then I decided I would look into it. And then I became interested in the role of religious thinking influencing economic thinking. And that's where the intellectual history book came from.
Well, I always ascribe your interest in this to the Jewish side of your upbringing. You had
that could be true, but there is zero. Well, that's not true. There is some stuff on the Hebrew Bible, of course, and there's even some things on the Dead Sea Scrolls, but there is very, very little Judaic content in either of those two books. And in fact, I'll tell you, I found that frustrating for just the reason that you said. And when I was working on the moral consequences of economic growth, I happened to be in London, and I went to see Rabbi Sachs, who.
Oh, yeah.
I went to who became, I wouldn't say a close friend, but became a friend. I went to see Rabbi Sachs, whose work I admire enormously. And I said, look, Rabbi, here I'm working on this book. And to my frustration, it's all about Calvin and Luther and, all sorts of other people. And, can we think of a way in which one could get some Judaic content into the book? And the answer was no. The answer was no. That
Really?
book has almost no Judaic content. And there's very, very little in the Religion and the Rise of Capitalism book either. So, but it was not for want of having the idea. If I had been able to do that, I would have. But thinking of the intellectual history book, for example, and again, for listeners who haven't read it, the book starts off with the influence, I argue, of religious thinking on the Smithian Revolution. Smith and Hume lived in Edinburgh. There were not many Jews in Edinburgh. I looked fairly hard to see if there was any evidence that Smith had ever met a Jew, and I couldn't find any. There were two American Jews who were studying at Edinburgh University when Smith was living in Edinburgh, but I couldn't find any evidence that Smith ever knew them. Hume famously did know a Jew. When Hume was working at the British Embassy in Paris, he became quasi-friendly with a Dutch Jew named Isaac de Pinto. And incidentally, if you ever go if you're ever in Amsterdam, and you go to the Portuguese synagogue, the big one in Amsterdam, right down the street is Isaac de Pinto's house with a sign on the front saying de Pinto House. And Hume and Isaac de Pinto had very lively correspondence about the nature of price setting in markets. So Hume absolutely did know a Jew, but it's not obvious that Smith ever did. So,
well, the big Jewish influence was in Amsterdam. In fact,
well,
yeah.
yes,
and
but there were Jews in the UK after.
Oh, well, but after 60, when Cromwell invited the Jews back.
Yeah, 1656. But again, they're saying that they were there, and maybe Smith did know some Jews in Edinburgh, but I have no evidence.
No, the reason I am aware of this is because you gave a speech. It was a conference of the NBER in your honor. And you started off with some sayings from Pirkei Avot. I don't remember what it was, but it might have been, if I am for myself, well, if I'm not for myself, then who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I?
Well, that's Hillel, of course.
Right.
Yeah, but well, I do that a lot. If you look in some of my books, often I use sayings, some from Avot, but some from other tractates of the Talmud. I use those as epigrams often at the front of chapters. So this is something I know a little bit about.
And you did win a prize from the Israeli, what was it, the Bank of Israel, David Horowitz Prize?
Yes, it was the central bank many years ago. I don't think they have the prize anymore, but there was a period when the Bank of Israel, in honor of their first governor, a man whom I never met named David Horowitz, set up a prize for the best paper in monetary economics. And I won it one year, and that was very nice. And there was they flew me over to Jerusalem, and they had a nice dinner and presented me with this prize and so forth. And it was all very nice. I was pleased to have won it, and I met a lot of interesting people when I was there. But that was fun. It's hard to believe that I'm pretty sure that's exactly 40 years ago. I think it was
1982.
Yeah, I think it was 82, but I remember the event fondly.
The person that would have, although MIT had perhaps more people, but Zvi Grilikus was in your department. Did you?
Oh, well, Zvi was not only in my department. Zvi had the Zvi of blessed memory because he died all too early. Zvi and I had offices immediately next to each other for 21 years.
Wow.
And
Zvi was a wonderful man. I always used to refer to him as the Gaon of Kovno. Zvi was famously from Lithuania and escaped the Holocaust, but he was not from Vilnius. He was from Kovno. So I always used to refer to Zvi as the Gaon of Kovno.
That's great. All right. Well, that's probably a good place for us to conclude this particular interview. There probably will be more.
Now I can say I've been interviewed by the Gaon of Brookline.
That's it. And let's not forget, what is it? Where are you from? I'm talking to Bob. Of Notre Dame.
Yes. The Gaon of Notre Dame.
That's a good one. I'm going to use that from now on. That's your title. All right. Well, we conclude by saying sei gesund.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation with both of you. I'm honored to take part in your series. Thank you for having me.
Great.
Thank you. And